Hey everybody, welcome back to Whiskey Central. If you're new here, my name is Shayla, and today we're talking about how whiskey is made. Alright, so first we're going to talk about Scotch whiskey production. It's very similar to bourbon production. A few kind of key things that are different. So we'll talk about Scotch first, and then I will put a link in the description box down below for the timestamp for when we start talking about bourbon. So the first step of the process is malting. I go over this in a bit more detail in my What is Malted Barley video. I'll link it in a card up here. But basically, barley is soaked in a steep a few times over a few days to hydrate the endosperm, and then it's laid out on a malting floor to germinate. During malting, the cell walls will break down, which allow alluron to convert the endosperm starch into sugar, and this will help feed the plant so it can grow a little root. Then you have kilning and gristing. Germination is halted by drying the barley in a kiln. This can be done with hot air or with peat fire, which we'll talk about in another episode. You now have dried barley that has a lot of starch and now activated enzymes, and you're ready to make grist. Malted barley is ground into grist to make their starches accessible for the next step. The grist has to be coarse enough that it won't stick together, but not so coarse that you can't access the starch inside the barley. Alright, and then it's time for mashing. The grist gets put into a mash tun with hot water a few times to extract the sugars. Each time the water gets warmer and warmer, and there is less and less sugar in each run. The first run is about 65 degrees Celsius, then 80, then 90. The third run has such a low sugar content that they don't use it yet for fermentation. It gets cooled down, and it's used as the water for the first mash of the next batch. Water allows the enzymes to finish the conversion from starch into fermentable sugars, and this warm liquid that's created is called wort. The leftover spent grains are called draft and are sent away to be processed as cattle feed. Alright, the next step is fermentation. The wort is moved into washbacks for fermentation, and washbacks are usually made from Oregon pine or cypress wood, which are resistant to fungi. But recently, stainless steel has been used as it's much easier to clean. Yeast is added to the wort, and it converts the fermentable sugars into heat, CO2, and alcohol. It also produces small quantities of other compounds known as congeners that contribute to the flavor of the whiskey. The wort ferments for 48 to 100 plus hours depending on the distillery. The result is a beer called wash with 8 to 11% alcohol. Alright, and then we have distillation. But the type of still you use is going to affect the end product. If you have a long, slim still, you're going to have a softer, lighter whiskey, and a short, squat still is going to produce a heavier whiskey. This all comes down to the contact that the whiskey has with copper. So the wash is pumped into the wash still, which is heated until it creates alcohol vapor, which has a lower boiling point than water. The vapor moves from the kettle to the neck, into the line arm, and over to a condenser. Usually this is a shell and tube condenser, but there are some distilleries that still use worm tubs, which we'll go over in a couple of weeks. The alcohol vapor rises through the line arm to the condenser and becomes low wines at 25% ABV. The low wines are moved into the second still, the spirit still, and the process is repeated again. This is split into feints, foreshots, and the heart or middle cut of this second distillate is the final spirit ready to be put into a barrel at 65 to 70% ABV. This is put into a spirit receiver before it's put into a barrel. Alright, then we have maturation, which is where at least 75% of the flavor comes from. For Scotch, you're going to be aging for at least 3 years in an oak barrel, and if you're in Ireland, you can use a different type of wood. And as the spirit is maturing, around 2% of the whiskey is lost each year to evaporation. This is called the angel share. There are many different sizes for casks, but the most common are 1, a barrel at 158 liters. For Scotch, this is most commonly going to be an ex-bourbon barrel. And then you have a hogshead at 250 liters and a butt at 500 liters. And these are the most common sizes for ex-sherry casks. Alright, so that's how Scotch is made. How is bourbon made? So it's a pretty similar process. I'll highlight a few of the differences. The first being the mash bill. You're going to start out with 51% corn and a secondary grain, which is usually rye or wheat, and then about 10 to 15% malted barley, which will help with fermentation. The corn, rye or wheat, and malted barley are ground into grist and put into a mash tun along with some water and some of the mash from the previous batch, usually. This is called the sour mash method. This gets put into a washback with yeast and ferments for a few days until it's beer. Alright, and then we get to the more difficult to explain topic, the column, coffee, or continuous still, which is different terms for the same thing. It's kind of hard to explain, so I'm going to do the best I can, and I'll leave some resources down below in case my explanation is really confusing, which it probably will be. This still can be fed continuously, and it's constantly making low wines. The low wines are moved into a spirit still, which is sometimes a doubler or thumper still, or even a pot still depending on the distillery. Continuous stills are used to make American whiskey and other grain whiskeys from around the world. It was invented by the Irishman Aeneas Coffey in the 1830s. So, wash gets put into the still at about the middle waypoint, and it flows down through a series of plates. Hot steam will come up from the bottom, and it'll start to vaporize the alcohol, which rises to higher plates in the still. Alright, so when alcohol hits the plate, it condenses. But as you go up, each plate gets further away from the heat source. So you've got alcohol that's condensing, but you also have hot alcohol vapor that's coming into the new plate, which re-vaporizes the condensed alcohol. This happens again and again through each plate in the column still. Depending on the distillery, there will be different kind of cut points, so they'll select from a plate or plates, and that'll be drawn off from the still and condensed. After the second distillation, it's put into a new charred oak barrel, and it's aged for at least 2 years if it's a straight bourbon. And if it's a straight bourbon and doesn't have an age statement, it has to be aged for at least 4 years. If it's a bottled and bond bourbon, the minimum is 4 years. Alright, so that's how Scotch and bourbon are made. Next week we'll be back with another review, but I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, leave it a like. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week. Scotch and bourbon are made. Shit. Okay. Okay, Shayla. That was a lot of distills. Oh boy. Okay. Am I recording? Shit. Okay. One of those is probably gonna work. Good. Boom, 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 boom. Done. Kilning and Gristing. There's a car. But right. Baby. Okay, I'm going insane. You're embarrassed, huh? I'm in Paris, bruh. You brought your whole crew. I'm with my parents, bruh. Every white dude in America went to the barber shop, give me the Macklemore haircut. Australia, they heard of me. Germany, they heard of me. Japan, they heard of me. It's a murder scene. You're gonna learn some things. My nickname, Ron Burgundy. I'm bad news with a pan flute in a plaid suit. No can do, no I don't work for free. I used to smoke that purple weed, sip a bunch of purple drink. Now that shit did not work for me, and now I just sip herbal tea.